Welcome to the Elixir podcast, where we ask people from all walks of life and from around the world what their favourite poem is and why it's important to them, why or how it speaks to their heart. If you have a poem that you would like to share and would like to appear on the podcast, please contact me at helenwing@me.com. Hello and welcome to today's Elixir podcast. Today we're talking to Richard, who is going to be reading some work by John Clare. Hello, Richard.
Hello.
Which poem are you going to be reading from?
I'm going to be reading from The Shepherd's Calendar, which, as the title implies, is a 12-part poem about the countryside and about the seasons of the year. And I'm going to be reading the last few verses of April. And as you'll see, he has a very different view of April from T.S. Eliot, who called it the cruelest month.
Okay, lovely. Could you read it to us first, please?
The season's beauties all are thine, that visit with the year, beauties that poets think divine, and all delight to hear. Thy latter days a pleasure brings that gladden every heart, pleasures that come like lovely things, but like to shades depart. Thy opened leaves and ripened buds the cuckoo makes his choice, and shepherds in thy greening woods first hear this cheering voice. And to thy ripened blooming bowers the nightingale belongs, and singing to thy parting hours keeps night awake with songs. With thee the swallow dares to come and primes his sooty wings, and urged to sing their yearly home, thy sons the martin brings. And lovely month be leisure mine, thy yearly mate to be, though May-day scenes may brighter shine, their birth belongs to thee. I wait me with thy rising sun, and thy first glories viewed, and as thy welcome hours begun, their sunny steps pursued. Now thy sun is on the set, like to a lovely eve. I view thy parting with regret, and linger loath to leave. Thou lovely April, fare thee well, thou early child of spring, though born where storms too often dwell, thy parents' news to bring. Yet what thy parting youth supplies, no other months excel. Thou first for flowers and sunny skies, sweet April, fare thee well.
Oh, wow. That's lovely. We can really see how much he adored April. So, Richard, why is this particular poem so meaningful for you?
So it's meaningful for me for several reasons. The most obvious one, and what drew me particularly to this poem, which I didn't know before, although I knew a lot of Clare's poetry, was that my father, before he died, chose some verses from that section to be read at his funeral. Particularly the verses about time passing and loath to leave, the beauty of April, and for him the beauty of this world. And he actually rearranged the lines that he chose so that it became a sort of poem about loss and death, which I thought was kind of rather wonderful when I realised what he'd done, to take a poem about a very positive poem about life and birth and rebirth, and turn it into a poem about death, but it sort of turns death into a positive, if you like, as a tribute to a life that was beautiful. As I said, it means a lot to me because I've always loved John Clare since I first came across him as a schoolboy. My dad always loved him. My dad came from the same part of the world as John Clare was writing about, the sort of the northern edge of the fens where they turn into Lincolnshire. And I've always felt very strongly that one of the reasons Dad liked John Clare was because he was describing so meticulously the countryside that Dad grew up in the middle of, this very striking landscape of the fens, the edge of the fens, where the dikes and the hedgerows sort of merge into each other with the open expanse of the fens on one side, and then the more rolling countryside of southern Lincolnshire on the other. And in the middle, you have this wildlife that Clare describes in really quite extraordinary detail. And if you find some of his other poems, he's actually a botanist and biologist. He's a zoologist. His poems are even now used as reference works for the flora and fauna of that landscape as it was 200 years ago now. So it sort of brings together that sort of two ideas, firstly of my dad, and secondly of a countryside that's actually now lost, and that John Clare was being lost even as John Clare wrote about it, but is somehow preserved. So both my dad and that landscape are somehow preserved in these lines.
Yeah, I was really taken by what you were saying about how observant he was. Didn't he once have an argument with John Keats about a nightingale?
Yes, and that's a very much a thing my dad would have done, actually, is to pick a fight with some grandiloquent London poet to tell him he'd got the details wrong, which is what John Clare did. John Clare and Keats actually had the same publisher, and the publisher who discovered Clare, Keats was this boy genius who everyone knew, even while he was still alive, and he was only 24 or something when he died.
Mm-hmm.
And the publisher was looking for other sort of countryside poets, because Keats was seen as a sort of romantic poet about the countryside, and his meanwhile John Clare had actually gone into a bookshop in Market Deeping, the village where my dad grew up, to buy a notebook to write his poems in, and he showed the shop owner his poems, and the shop owner passed them on to this publisher, who immediately saw their value, and particularly because he was a rustic. John Clare was entirely self-taught. He left school when he was 11. He had no formal training. He just taught himself to write poetry by reading poetry. He came from a totally impoverished background, and he was marketed as a sort of peasant poet. But he never really sort of grew out of being a peasant poet. I think they thought that he would become some London literary figure, but he went to London once and absolutely hated it, and went back to the countryside as fast as he could. And he then realised that there was this famous poet, John Keats, who also wrote about the countryside, because he learned of him through this publisher, and he started reading his poems, and he was shocked because they weren't true. And he particularly objected to the nightingale, which he felt had missed all the important bits about a nightingale's habitat. And he wrote his own several poems about nightingales, and indeed he mentions the nightingale in this poem here. And Keats himself wrote how he didn't like Clare's poetry either, because he thought all Clare was doing was just describing what he saw, and he thought that was very dull. Whereas, of course, he was sort of writing in the elevated classical poetry that he had been taught. So there's a great clash of ideas of what poetry is. I think nowadays we can probably find space for both.
Yeah, I think so. John Clare had quite a sad life, by the sounds of it.
He was, I think, 70 when he died. The tragedy was he spent decades in a lunatic asylum, but he was already a very sad character. I mean, he was someone who never taught. His father was a labourer in the countryside, sort of a casual farmhand. He had a number of brothers and sisters, grew up in great poverty. And he never really escaped his poverty, except when this book of poems was published and it really took off and he became a sort of sensation. But he never really replicated that success, and he drank all the money. He was a bit of a wastrel. He totally messed up his love life. For reasons that really weren't his own fault, he fell in love with a girl who was too good for him, whose family wouldn't countenance the marriage, and so he kind of abandoned her and married somebody he didn't love, and then had children with her, but then kept writing poetry about the girl he was really in love with, and that didn't go down well really at home. And he felt very guilty about that, so he'd go on these massive drinking benders. And he was taken up by local aristocrats who gave him a allowance, but just the wrong amount of allowance, if you like, because it was exactly the amount of allowance that you could blow quite easily and not invest for the future, while at the same time giving you the impression that you could sort of do that for the rest of your life and live off these local notables. I think it was the Marquis of Exeter was one of them, and various other bigwigs. And he carried on writing poetry, but his poetry is of very variable quality, no doubt about that, which was again not uncommon. I mean, Wordsworth really can't be held to account for some of his poetry. But as time passed, he became more and more depressed, and that seems to have led to physical illnesses and mental weakness, as I think it would have been called. And I don't know if he's ever been given a sort of like posthumous diagnosis by a modern psychiatrist, but his mental state declined. And he wasn't someone who was, wrongly diagnosed as being mad when he in fact was brilliant. He knew that he was not in full control of his faculties.
Oh, yes, and didn't he write about that in his poetry, actually?
He tried to escape, but then was unable to look after himself. He tried to look after himself, but couldn't, so was taken back. And he wrote his most famous poem in a way, which is unlike all his other ones, about being abandoned in the mental hospital. I don't think his wife came to see him very much, and his main companion, as I say, was the governor of the hospital, who seemed to be a rather humane man. But he wrote this poem, I Am, which I say is probably his best-known poem, about being forsaken. I am yet what I am, who cares or knows? My friends forsake me like a memory lost. I am the self-consumer of my woes. They rise and vanish, an oblivious host. Shadows of life whose very soul is lost. And yet I am, I live. I mean, he's very self-pitying, but he's also very aware that he's responsible for his own misery in some sense, and that he shouldn't be self-pitying. But he's been cut off from the land he knows, the world he knows. And he also can see it dying before him, because this was the time that the fens were being drained and enclosed for farming, for the mass agricultural production that the fens is being used for now, and the hedgerows and the copses and the woods were all being ripped up, and the marshes drained, and this wonderful wildlife that he was writing about was being destroyed, and their habitats destroyed. And I think he felt that also at a very physical level, and that also contributed to his madness, as well as the element that was self-induced.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And he obviously recognised that those changes would constitute the loss of a world, if you like, and maybe the loss of his world.
Yes, I mean, if I was Keatsian, I think you could see it as a blow to the soul. I mean, this was someone who felt himself very much part of the natural world that he was describing and living amongst. That he was, he was a son of the soil, to use the cliche, and in a way that's, I think, quite hard to imagine now. I mean, if in a world before any form of mechanization, where you really were working the soil with your hands as a farmer, as a farm labourer, you know what the month is by what buds are coming out and what birds are returning to their habitats.
Mm.
And I think he must have felt the destruction of these habitats as a blow to his soul. Though, as I say, he doesn't actually describe it like that, because he describes it so vividly and so materially.
Mm. I don't think anybody realised quite how deeply interested your father was in John Clare until after he died, and we discovered an entire bookcase of books either by or about John Clare. But knowing your father a bit and knowing his love for his home in Market Deeping, it's fully understandable. And then, of course, the other thing that your daughter Lily noticed was how similar John Clare looks to your father.
Yes, I've always wondered about this. I mean, I've always wondered whether they might be related, and I've sometimes thought I'd spend my retirement doing the family tree to see if there is a relationship there. As I say, John Clare came from 5 miles away from where my dad's family are from. In my dad's mother's family, I should say. My dad's father came from London. And he has the same chin and the same quite earnest look of the young John Clare. As I say, the later John Clare was very sad character. And of course, I mean, I knew that Dad had loved John Clare, but I didn't realise. I think I didn't realise two things. One was how much he appreciated the language of John Clare. I mean, I know that sounds an odd thing to say about a poet, but Dad had shared this meticulousness of John Clare, as anyone who knew Dad would say, that Dad was also very focused on detail and thought that detail was very important in description, and John Clare has that absolute sort of that intensity of observation. I mean, Dad had it about things to do with the law and so on, rather than things to do with the countryside. He did know about the countryside, obviously. I didn't realise that Dad had such an appreciation of how to use language, which was perhaps a failing of mine to understand that, because this text and the other text he chose for his funeral service, which in a very meticulous way he had sketched out in great detail what he wanted for his funeral service, and he'd given descriptions of why he wanted the readings that he'd chosen, and they are incredibly cleverly chosen and very spoke to very specific elements of Dad's character that he was obviously very aware of, as well as appreciative of, in terms of references to his childhood like this. So I think that sense of being at one with this poet whose books have always been on his bookshelves, I think I never kind of fully appreciated until I read this poem after Dad died. This is not a poem I'd known before. It's a very, very long poem, but it does, of course, have this great resonance about a part of the world that is now sort of rather neglected in some ways. It's not, a place that tourists go. It's not a place that people visit very much. And it is a place that has continued to change. It's changed even since my childhood, when I used to go and visit my grandmother there. If you go there now, it's changed again. It's a landscape that at any time you look at it looks very permanent, as arable land looks like in a way, because it's so productive. You think, oh my God, that's been producing like this forever. But now it's all fruit farms, and in a way that before it was all, open fields of wheat. And that change is something that's so intense that now we've sort of rather lost any sense that it seems shocking to some people in those days, in Claire's time, that change would ever happen. Now we're so used to change happening so rapidly that I think it's hard to appreciate Clare for what he was saying to his contemporary readers.
Thank you, Richard. I think that lots of people now go and look at some of John Clare's poetry again, because it is rather a shame that this wonderful man seems to be pushed aside so much. Would you do us the very great favour of reading your poem again, so that your listeners can hear it in the context that you have given it.
So this, as I say, is the last few stanzas of April from The Shepherd's Calendar by John Clare. The season's beauties all are thine, that visit with the year, beauties that poets think divine, and all delight to hear. Thy latter days a pleasure brings that gladden every heart, pleasures that come like lovely things, but like to shades depart. Thy opened leaves and ripened buds the cuckoo makes his choice, and shepherds in thy greening woods first hears the cheering voice, and to thy ripened blooming bowers the nightingale belongs, and singing to thy parting hours keeps night awake with songs. With thee the swallow dares to come and primes his sooty wings, and urged to seek their yearly home thy sons the martin brings. And lovely month be leisure mine, thy yearly mate to be, though May Day seems may brighter shine, their birth belongs to thee. I wait me with thy rising sun, and thy first glories viewed, and as thy welcome hours begun, their sunny steps pursued. And now thy sun is on the set, like to a lovely eve, I view thy parting with regret, and linger loath to leave. Thou lovely April, fare thee well, thou early child of spring, though born where storms too often dwell, thy parents' news to bring. Yet what thy parting youth supplies, no other months excel. Thou first for flowers and sunny skies, sweet April, fare thee well.
Oh, that's really lovely, Richard. I'm sure all of our listeners will have worked out that we are sending this podcast out into the world at the very beginning of April in the hope of having sunny skies and lots of flowers. Thank you again for being on our podcast this time, Richard.
Thank you for letting me talk about it.
If you're a regular listener and are enjoying the podcast, it would mean the world to me if you could hit the follow button on your podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review and a 5-star rating. Remember, you can find the poems that feature in each episode on my website, helenwing.com. If you'd like to support the production costs of our Elixir Poetry podcast, please feel free to buy me a coffee. Thanks for listening.